Welcome to Theme 3, Law, Order, and Violence. I'm Susan Hirsch. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I teach at George Mason University in the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. And I have a co-discussant, Professor Francis Fukuyama, then at the end. And we have two very interesting papers by Beatrice Magaloni and Rachel Kleinfeld. And the way we'll do it is that Beatrice will give her paper, and then we'll ask Professor Fukuyama to discuss it. Rachel's paper, Mia's discuss it, general discussion. And I'm going to do my best to keep us moving. So,
Thank you.
Without
Thank
further
you,
ado,
Susan.
thanks.
I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this project. I've been working on it for the last 4.5 years, and it's been really sort of a very intense and fascinating investigation into the sources of social order and policing. And I think that our findings really will illuminate not only what happens in Rio, but more broadly what is happening in many cities around the developing world. So I want to begin by motivating, what drove me to this topic is that deaths that occur in conflict settings, so meaning homicides, are 20 times more than deaths that are caused by civil wars. And the literature in political science and economics has focused a significant amount of research on the sources, the causes, the mechanisms of civil war, but there is significantly less understanding of these, types of violence that is affecting many countries around the world. And as many of you might know, Latin America is the most violent region in the world. It has 30% of the world's homicides and around 8% of the world's population. And we have 43 of the 50 most dangerous cities in the world. And this is a map that, a graph that came in The Economist like a month ago that cites actually the source that I'm citing here, which is a Mexican NGO that looks at the violence in the cities. And as you can see, most of the cities of there are in Latin America. Venezuela's Caracas is the most murderous city in the world, and then San Pedro Sula in Honduras. El Salvador ranks there less violent than Honduras, but now, violence has increased as the truce between gangs collapsed, and then so on. So we see, Mexico, obviously Colombia, and then Brazil, which, is the focus of my presentation. And one of the striking things in Brazil is that although in that graph, it doesn't have one of the most violent cities in the world, it has many, many cities that are in this graph. So only last year there were 60,000 murders in the country, and in terms of sheer numbers of people who are dying in the world, this is the most violent country. The United States, of course, has some cities, and I'm not going to talk about that, but I think that some of the dynamics that I'm discussing in this paper are relevant for cities in the US as well. So the broad research questions are about the causes of these violence epidemics. I also want to understand what are the characteristics of parallel social orders that are ruled by criminal gangs, militias, or vigilante murderers. These parallel, forms of order really normally coexist with wealthy areas in cities that generally, sort of are ruled by the state. And in the case of Rio de Janeiro, just because of its special topography, you see favelas that are located next to the wealthiest, neighborhoods in the world. So that is a very striking contrast. And literally, social order can shift from one street to the other. And the last question, which is really more the focus of this paper, is about the process through which the state can, and I quote, take back control of these territories, control violence, and establish a system of universal rule of law, which is really what the topic of this conference is about. So let me give you a very short introduction to Rio's violence problem. It's quite extensive in the paper, so if you're interested in this topic, there is a lot of details about the history of violence in Rio. But just to give you, a short presentation, there are around 800 favelas in the city, with close to 20% of the city's population living in these favelas. The state consciously refused to provide public goods in these settings, including policing. These favelas are inhabited mostly by migrants that came from the northeast part of the city. Many of them are black inhabitants. And police generally only used to enter the favelas as part of military operations. I will talk a little bit about those later, and also to take their monthly payments from the traffickers. So the way that the favela residents experienced the police was violence and corruption. There is a very long history of police violence, and this is really what brought my attention to Rio. There was a very famous bravery bonus that was implemented from 1995 to 1998 that literally pay police officers a higher salary if they engage in shootouts and killed criminals. And by the way, these bravery bonus, because of legal protection, these police officers still receive them, although the system has changed. So they are no longer rewarded, but those that were rewarded with the bonus, they still continue to receive them. And there is a very peculiar figure that is called autos de resistencia, meaning that when the police kills someone, it is immediately presumed that that's a legitimate action and that the killing happened because the suspect resisted arrest. So one of the interesting aspects of this process is that at least we have very detailed information of the number of police killings that I would go more in detail in the paper. So with this long history of violence, there was a very interesting decision taken in 2008 by the government to quote-unquote pacify the favelas. And the idea was that the government really wanted to take control back from these favelas that were controlled mostly by drug traffickers and factions that started to dominate the favelas in the 1980s, although some of these favelas are also controlled by militias. Militias are formed by former police officers, firemen, and prison guards that take control of the favelas, and they also extort citizens to provide public services. So as you can see, in only one city, you have all this concentration of, different social orders. So the method of the pacification was a very interesting, is a very interesting one. So first, because they know that they are really fighting with heavily armed drug traffickers. I mean, these drug traffickers, just to give you an idea, one faction, which is the Comando Vermelho, has attacked the city 3 times and has burned, in one of them, 60 buses at a time. So they have really huge capacity for violence. So if you are going to enter a favela, the regular police cannot just enter it. So what they propose is that they would send the BOPE, which is a militarized elite unit, to first invade the favela. They announce the invasion, and most of the time, because the BOPE's might is really very credible, what has happened is that drug traffickers flee the favela. There is a very famous video that catches all the, many traffickers fleeing one of the largest favelas, which is the Complexo Alemán. And then the BOPE and sometimes the military stays for, 3-4 months, or even in this case, in the Complexo Alemán, it was 1 year. When they think that this territory is stabilized, they send the pacifying police units, which are dressed in blue, and that they are really supposed to be police-friendly, citizen-friendly police, inspired by proximity ideas. So this is to give you an idea of what the BOPE looks like. This is the sign of the BOPE. It's a skull with 2 pistols and a knife. When we went literally to do interviews the first time, this is not a lie. They received you with a, sort of long weapon to the head of the taxi driver. And then we went and interviewed. There we are interviewing with the sub-commander of the BOPE. And so this is the image that they want to give, that they are really, this type of very mighty force, and has been used repeatedly to invade the favelas in different military operations. They explained to us that to graduate as a BOPE officer, only 4% of those who want to become this type of police actually are able to graduate from the 6-month lengthy course. So it's a very selective battalion. And this was the new image that the police wanted to give. These are the UPP. A very important idea of the UPP is that the police knew that if they were going to send sort of officers with long trajectory in the corporation, they were going to just repeat very violent practices. So they purposely only wanted to assign their young police officers recently graduated from the academy. As it turns out, this has changed over the course of time, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. As police officers have felt threatened, they have introduced BOPE officers into the favelas. So we've done a really large set of sort of research in this setting, but the one I'm talking about stems from a statistical analysis that georeferences all the homicides and police killings in the city from 2005 to 2014. We also have collected a large police survey of more than 500,000 officers. We also have digitalized consumption of ammunition by each police officer and their trajectory in the military police, so we can know which officers are shooting disproportionately. I presented this work in last summer in front of 150 commanders of the police, and I was very happy to hear that after the presentation they removed some of these officers from the street, and they put them in a special course. So the research is really having its impact, and we're happy about that. Then we are also analyzing the victims of police violence. We conducted focus groups, and we right now just received a survey of more than 6,000 favela residents regarding their experiences of pacification. And finally, we are conducting a randomized control evaluation of the use of police body-worn cameras in one of the largest favelas of Rio. I hope with all this work we really can gain an understanding of how to build or pacify these settings, which really requires a change in police behavior. So I'm going to really skip with the statistical models quickly. So what we really find to, try to understand in this paper is how much did the reform impact the decrease in homicides and police violence in the city. So these are homicides, and the red area are police killings. As you can see, it's like 25% of the homicides in the city are accounted by police killings. By the end of the period that we are studying, there is a 60% reduction of police killings and more or less 40% reductions of homicides. So there is a really big progress making that has been made in Rio. So these are the entire favelas in the city, and these were the pacified favelas. So obviously there is a problem of which favelas were selected for pacification. That is explained in the paper. So the government purposely selected favelas that were near the wealthy South Zone because they knew they were going to receive the World Cup and the Olympics, and also because that's the center of wealth and economic activity in the city. So these favelas, as we explained in the paper, were significantly easier to pacify. They are also located in these sort of hills, and they normally have only one entrance, so the police has much more control of everything that goes in and out of the favelas. But as the pacification progressed, things became more complicated. So there is another reason why the police selected the favelas that they selected. So one of them, very interesting one, is that they targeted the most violent drug cartel, the Comando Vermelho. And the other fascinating, I think, point is that they didn't target favelas controlled by militias. So in a way, the state really tolerates the rule of militias that are, as I explained, former police officers and so on. So I'll jump on this. This is a really fascinating picture of how wealth and violence are very strongly correlated in Rio. The data that we have collected allows us to make that evaluation. So this is very much detail of all the empirical efforts that we did and all the modeling to really try to identify whether the changes that we are observing result from the UPP. One of the, I think, most stringent analysis that we do is that we focus on the borders. So these are the UPP. So this is a complex Alemán, which, as I say, is one of the most violent. So we focus on the border of the UPP and compare 100 meters inside and 100 meters outside the UPP, and see whether that difference really, we believe, can be attributed to the implementation of the UPP. So to summarize, our empirical results are surprising and interesting. One important result is that the UPP had no effect in reducing homicides in the city. In the city's favelas. So that means that the favelas still have 2 or 3 times higher homicide rates than in the wealthy middle class areas. But the UPP had a very powerful impact in reducing police killings, and this is really, to us, very excellent news. Police killings would have been 60% higher had the UPPs not been introduced, which means around 300 lives been saved in this period, which is significant. So one of the ways in which we can read this reform is that the state is finally becoming more accountable to for killing, for killing when it polices the streets. But they are really not. I mean, these are really sort of mixed results, as you can see. So there are signs of increase of tensions in the areas of the UPPs, especially after 2013. More police officers are being killed. And I think that what happens and what our informants tell us is that the traffickers understood one of the key weaknesses of this reform, which is the cops themselves. So they have purposely decided to target the police. In many of the interviews that we have had, in one of the interviews that we had, the police unit had been attacked the week before. This was in Ciudad de Dios, and that really began a new spike of violence. So as the police feels more threatened, they are also starting to kill back. And the legitimacy of the UPP started to become in question. I don't go into big details, but corruption, torture, scandals, and the high visibility of fatal shootings, especially because of social media. So to conclude, I think that this process, which I believe can illuminate the processes around other cities in the world where the state really tries to regain, as I say, control of territory. What this tells us is that the process of regaining territory is as much as fighting for territory as fighting for over people. Even drug gangs, and this is a lot of what we find in our interviews, both in Mexico and in Brazil, have social and popular support. This popular support is built through a combination of coercion and cooptation strategy. And without the cooperation of the population, the police is not going to be able to deter crime. So that's one of the big explanations, we believe, why the police has not been able to deter homicides. As one officer tells us, a lot of what we, referring to the police, can do to stop traffickers depends on what favela residents tells us. When they approach us, we know we're doing something right. But most time, citizens don't trust us. So that's a. And this is another important insight in terms of how the pacification is impacted territories differently. What we really understand is that imperfect control of a territory by the police is really a very poor equilibrium. Citizens will not approach the police when they fear that the traffickers that are in their communities will retaliate. So as this resident in Ciudad de Dios tells us, the police officers do talk to people here in the community, but residents are scared, of course. They might be a crook on the other side of the street looking at you, They might think you are snitching on them, that you are denouncing something. So this imperfect control of the territory is something that the police is struggling with. So the big conclusion we find is that this effort at pacification really hinges on a very delicate balance between the use of force and police violence and police legitimacy. So it is really essential sometimes for the police to use force. As we hear it from a lot of our interviews, they really fear that when the police doesn't control the territory, the traffickers are going to come back and exert their tyrannical order. But if the police cannot really use so much violence, or if it uses so much violence in doing this, it's going to really undermine its legitimacy. So in the end, this fine balance is really what I think the police in Rio is really striking to find. Thank you for the. Thank you. I think I should take this off now.
5 to 10, okay. So it's,
Which would you like?
well, we'll see. So it's a great pleasure.
I'll tell you it.
Okay, thank you. It's a great pleasure to comment on Beatriz. She's my colleague at CDDRL, and I've been following this project, and I can tell you she's sitting on a ton more data than she's revealed in this paper, and so we're all looking forward to it as it goes out. So I think Beatriz is following in the footsteps of the great James Q. Wilson, who decided when he was in his 50s that you couldn't do anything fundamentally as a society to alter the deep roots of crime, but you could affect policing. And it turns out that there is a huge variance in outcomes depending on the particular method of policing that's chosen. One contemporary example of that is the difference between Nicaragua and the Northern Triangle in Central America. So Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala have just skyrocketing murder and extortion rates. Neighboring Nicaragua is one of the most peaceful countries in Latin America. And I think that most of that difference is actually due to the fact that the Nicaraguans, you know, the chief of police is not a ninja in one of these black, you know, militarized outfits, but a woman. They walk around in T-shirts, very much like the UPP. It's also an issue in American policing, where there's been a huge contrast between, you know, the Daryl Gates LAPD style of militarized policing and community policing that's been used in other communities to great success. So I would say, Beatriz, the thing that you need in your project is actually a little bit more developed a theory of policing, right? Because you're saying that it requires force and it also requires legitimacy. But I think that you can connect it to a broader literature out there in criminology about what the causes of violence are, which obviously gets into Rachel's paper as well. I would schematically say it's kind of the difference between, let's say, Gary Becker and a sociologist like Robert Sampson. You know, Becker thinks it's a matter of incentives, so you just raise the costs of committing crime sufficiently and you'll get less crime. And Sampson has always argued that it's really a normative issue in communities having to do with the community's ability to maintain a normative framework that the police simply, plug into. And I would say that, so Beatriz's data illustrates, that this is actually, quite a, the Sampson model of connecting to the normative order is actually quite powerful. And I think the results statistically in terms of the police killings, is quite striking. So this particular approach to policing really was an innovation and really had a strong measurable effect. The bigger question in my mind is why the homicide rate didn't come down, right? And there, Beatriz does this very nice statistical effort to control for other factors because, as she indicated in one of her charts, crime rates and homicide rates were coming down across the board in Brazil in this entire period. And so you have to disaggregate what's due to different policing practices from, Bolsa Familia and general economic growth and, a lot of other things that were going on. And so she does that. But I think that conceptually, it's a mistake to actually separate out the kinds of social policy interventions from the police interventions. And I think that that may be part of the weakness of the whole UPP process, because it really was regarded as a, just a reform of the police use of violence, kind of separated or compartmentalized off from the other kinds of social programs that were going on. And that really does have to do with this question of the normative order in these communities, and the fact that the people that live in these communities, some of them are hardened criminals. I would say actually probably the majority of them are people that actually would prefer to live in a safe neighborhood without drug gangs and so forth. And so the whole issue of successful policing is how you peel away that layer of people from the people that really are making their livings off of killing and looting and trafficking in drugs. And that's, I think, where the integration with other kinds of interventions that don't have to do with the police is really important. So, you and Alberto have heard me say this before, but if you contrast what the UPP, and especially like the Mexican police are even worse in this regard, because they don't even have something like the UPP, but if you contrast that to what happened in Medellin, Colombia, where you had a decrease in the murder rate from 400 per 100,000 people in 1991 at the peak of the Escobar rampage down to it's about 80 per 100,000 today. They had the police component of it, so there was a buildup of the army, there was a retaking of neighborhoods through sheer application of military force. There was an effort to do community policing, but it was heavily integrated with a number of social interventions whose main purpose was to build trust in the community. And it was actually very related to the police activity. It wasn't to make these people happy and prosperous and so forth. They didn't have any illusions they could do that. What they wanted was intelligence. What they wanted to know where the drug traffickers were. They wanted to be able to map those neighborhoods and then to be able to separate those people from the hardcore either paramilitaries or criminal gangs. And that's why they did things like build a Spanish library and the Metro Cable that was, an effort to connect the community to the, main transportation hub in the city. Sergio Fajardo, who was the mayor at that time, said, we're going to put the most beautiful infrastructure in the poorest neighborhoods of the city. Why was that? Why did he do that? It was just for the symbolic purpose of showing, that poor community that the municipal government actually could provide something that, marked their status and dignity and so forth. And quite frankly, it was to get information out of them because that would allow them to then, be willing to cooperate with the police. And so as Beatriz was saying, that by itself is not enough. I mean, if the police don't stay there and, with enough violent, potential violent force to really protect people, that's not going to work either. But I think what they did in Medellin was to link the social programs very directly, with the changes in police practice. And I think that's what made it particularly important. And my impression from everything you've said about the UPP is that, there are different parts of the Brazilian government that are handling the social interventions and the police interventions. They're not particularly well integrated and not particularly thought out as a, as a complete package. By the way, I think the single group that has thought this through the most carefully is the U.S. Army. So if you go, you go to this FM 3-24, which is their counterinsurgency manual. I mean, this is basically what you're talking about. So they say, how do you, prosecute a counterinsurgency war? First three priorities are win popular support, 1, win popular support, 2, win popular support, 3. And so what they call the kinetic side of counterinsurgency is really subordinated to a fight over legitimacy, the ability to actually convince the population that you are A, going to be able to protect them, and B, that the state as an institution actually has something to offer them, even if it's only a kind of symbolic recognition of the fact that they exist as citizens. So I suspect that that's kind of what the problem in Brazil is, and that's even worse a problem in Mexico, where they don't even they didn't even get the idea that if you put the police in these nice uniforms, you might actually get better cooperation. So I have comments on Rachel as well, but I'll sit down.
Thank you. So next we'll hear from Rachel Kleinfeld. Yeah, and is the title the one here? Yes, or privilege violence. All right, I'll let you.
Moved on.
You give the title.
Let's see, where's the clicker thing?
Yes, please.
Sorry about that. Yes, thank you.
I would say, Frank, that the U.S. Army is maybe better at conceptualizing and implementing their strategy, but also they've got an almost Marxist view of hearts and minds. It's a very economic view, and pretty thin on dignity. But so the reason that I've got a couple of different titles here is that I wasn't quite sure what I was going to present, and what I've decided is to present an upcoming book in the whole, but the paper is only half of what you're going to see here. And the reason I'm doing that is that last time I was here, I told you that I was starting a book and gave you some very preliminaries on some of the early methodological issues I was facing. now I've completed the field research for the book, and I can't put it all in a paper because it's a book. It's that kind of work. And so the paper is the first half of it, and I would love comments on the paper because it's supposed to go into the annual review if I can make it that good. And so it could really use some help. But whenever I present just the problem, everyone asks about the solution. And so there's no point in presenting just the problem because people will want to know the rest. So hence this new paper. So the question I've been asking for the last couple of years is, how have weak, highly violent democracies reduced violence legitimately and sustainably, and this is a perfect follow-on to Beatrice's paper because it touches on many of the same issues, to control state and non-state violence. And from a methodological perspective, I was looking at democracies, not autocracies, because of course autocracies have a fairly simple method of increasing state violence to control non-state violence, and that's not interesting. I was looking at violence and corruption rather than rule of law as a whole, because I couldn't find any examples of countries that had been very bad in the rule of law that had gotten much better in modern times, which was unfortunate. I was looking at the political unit level, not enclaves of excellence. So working with the grain, Brian's work, we have contentious discussions, friendly contentious discussions about this. I tend to think that the political unit really matters for questions of violence control. And so whether it's a city level, state level, or country level, I didn't want to just look for this intervention or that intervention. Positive deviance based on change, not on endpoint. So my research assistant, when we were doing this work, came back to me at the beginning and said, you really need to look at Austria. Austria has really brought down violence levels, and it's very statistically significant. And I said, oh, you know, Austria is not going to offer much help to Honduras. That's the goal. So starting from extremely low point, significant movement that's been sustained. This turns out to be an incredibly difficult problem, and I've written a whole report on it, but we can get into it later on the sustainability. And I did case research to do this. So I went to Ghana, Georgia, Colombia, Sicily, Bahar, also went to the US South where the barbecue is better. And then I looked at a lot of counter cases because, of course, this is picking on the dependent variable. That's a problem methodologically. And so I looked at a variety of counter cases, both cases that were sort of shadow cases. So Sicily got better from mob violence. The rest of Italy actually has a significant problem with the mob still. Jaharkhand got pulled off of Bahar in 2000. So looking at that sort of natural experiment case, looking at cases of places that had similar power structures and remained violent, and places that had also reduced violence and followed different paths. So I was trying to come at the counter cases from a number of different examples. I didn't do quantitative work, and this is extremely problematic to me, and I would love thoughts on it as well. The data here, I don't know the FDI data, but it sounds like we've been, where's Eric? It sounds like we're in a similar boat. The data on the issues that I'm looking at are just execrable. And homicide data is really problematic, among other things. It oversamples Latin America, undersamples sub-Saharan Africa. Civil war data is the opposite. And putting the data together is really problematic. So this is interacting with a whole series of literatures as well. So there's a state-building literature. There's a democracy and good governance literature that people have worked on quite a bit. And then there's an empirical literature. And the empirical literature is divided into civil wars, insurgencies, gangs, organized crime, electoral violence, and never the twain shall meet. So these are completely different literatures. They rarely speak to one another. And they all come up with a lot of different ideas. And what I was looking at was compounded violence. So what I wanted to know was there are a series of countries that have a lot of different kinds of violence. Pakistan, Mexico, Nigeria, insurgent violence, militia violence, vigilante violence, gang violence, trafficker violence. Is there something that relates these kinds of violence to each other? This is the dependent variable. And if you think of the new SDGs, which SDG 16 is looking at violence of all types, we're going to need to figure this out. And the literature is really a black hole in this area. Nobody's looking at interdependencies. And what I say in the paper is it's a little bit as if a woman goes to a doctor and says, hey, I'm gaining weight, and the doctor says I have to go on a diet. And then she goes back and says, I'm having mood swings, and the doctor says, oh, you know, take a pill for that. And then she goes back again and says, I'm tired all the time, and he gives her some iron supplements, and it turns out she's pregnant. Right? So these are different problems. I'm not saying that terrorism and insurgency are civil war. I'm not saying civil war is organized crime. They're different things, but they might have effects that interrelate, and that's what I was really wanting to look at. So there's a whole series of theories that look at these problems. Generally, these theories are connected to one type of violence, right? So is poverty the cause? Is state weakness, state territories, mountains a problem? Demography, lots of young men. Grievance greed literature, inequality. This is deeper in the homicide literature, but in Civil War now they're starting to look at inequality mapping onto ethnic or religious pre-existing problems. Regime type, there's a whole literature on anocracy and violence. It turns out there's endogeneity problems that cause problems with that entire literature, but then there's still a transition literature. So there's a whole lot of theories for why certain kinds of violence are happening. Based on my case research, I came up with a theory that combines a number of these. And again, I'm a policymaker, so I don't have to be parsimonious. But what I was looking at was extreme compounded violence. And what I saw was that when you see it in two situations. One are situations of an extremely, extremely weak state. So this is Yemen, this is Somalia, this is Libya. I'm not going to say the word anarchy because it has its own connotations, but extraordinary state weakness. The other situation is a state of privilege, and that's what I really wanted to delve into because state weakness is pretty self-explanatory why you see this kind of violence there. What you see, and in the US was one of my cases, I was looking at the US West and municipal corruption in the post-Civil War and Gilded Age and the US South. In the US during this period of time, for some years you had one lynching every 3 days for a number of years in the US. But if you look at the map, by 1900, you're not seeing that kind of lynching in the West, right? You see a couple of data points every once in a while. But the West, which is actually where government was much thinner, was not the problem. The problem of lynching in the West got solved by the time of the closing of the frontier. As government moved in, as people settled, as they brought normative communities to the West, the problem of lynching largely stopped. But look at the South, right? Here's another picture of the South. Now, the South is not a weak state in these years. The South has a fairly developed state that's been developed for a long time, and yet you see these patterns of lynching violence and so on through the Redneck Riviera, up the Mississippi Delta, and so on in certain mountainous areas. And so what's going on? And the US is a nice microcosm for what I saw repeated in pattern in each of the countries that I was looking at. And what I saw was a three-part pattern that explains this violence. First, you have extremes with extreme privilege. And they want to maintain impunity for that extreme privilege. Sometimes this privilege was illegal. Sometimes it was corruption of one sort or another. Sometimes it was semi-legal. So I did quite a bit of research in Honduras. And in Honduras, the person who runs the major fast food franchise, which is one family, after Hurricane Mitch, managed to get a law written into the tax code that exempted all fast food from taxes. Well, so that's legal, that's lobbying, but it's extreme privilege of one sort or another. And they want to maintain impunity, and in weak democracies, weak factionalized democracies, they really need to maintain power as well as impunity because it's extremely dangerous to lose power or to lose impunity. You get locked up in jail or you get killed or exiled. Sometimes, therefore, in order to maintain their impunity, they support violent non-state actors. So this is Bihar. There's a series of militias that are tied with landlords in Bihar. They're fighting Maoist militias, so their raison d'etre is guerrilla warfare. It's similar in Colombia. But they're also protecting various types of land grabs and feudal orders. And the best example I can give of this is actually medieval England, which is a very similar situation, and it was similar in Colombia after La Violencia, which is a bit of doggerel. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but lets the greater felon loose who steals the common from off the goose. And that's what you see going on here, right? These are landlord-led militias, elite-led militias, and the poor respond in kind. In order to maintain that kind of privileged immunity, the police forces have to become brutalized. So as Beatriz notes in Brazil, it's not simply that the security forces happen to be brutalized. What happens is they're politicized. The politicization to enable the elites to get off scot-free has to also encompass the violent groups that the elites are supporting. And so it ends up being a larger group of people. And what you see are political hacks literally sitting at police stations saying you can arrest him, you can't arrest him. Or if someone gets arrested, them getting a call and saying you must let that person out. They're connected to my caste, they're connected to my group or what have you. Those policing norms, if you look in India, there's a National Commission report in 1980 that basically just talks about the breakdown of any sort of order in the police because your lower level police are looking for higher level political roofs for protection, for promotion, for patronage or one sort or another. There's no way to enforce order within the police systems because of that. And so even if only a small number of people are actually being given impunity, the system of internal order within the police totally breaks down as a result of this. The police also often become brutal. Sometimes they're brutal because they're connected to corruption groups of their own. They're connected to militias in the way that Brazil's was. That's not unusual. Sometimes they're brutalized because they're actually the honest cops in the situation where they can't actually lock up the people that they want to lock up, and they get frustrated. And so you see that kind of violence too. Well, what happens to the people? The people, understandably, think that they can't trust their government and they can't trust their security forces. And so they start looking for other forms of protection. And this is why you start seeing people going to drug cartels, people going to insurgencies, and so on. This is Pablo Escobar's housing project. He built a huge housing project. And this Robin Hood behavior is extremely common. And the criminals know what they're doing. Jesse James in the American West teams up with an editor of a Southern paper and starts spreading these rumors of himself as a Southern Confederate fighting Northern corporate forces like the railroads, and nobody likes the railroads and the trusts. And he gets so much support from this PR that the Missouri state legislature actually votes to give him amnesty. And when that vote only passes by a majority, not by a 2/3 vote, which is needed for amnesty, they then vote to cap any reward that the Northern appointed governor can offer on Jesse James. Now, there's a murderer, there's a bank robber, but the legislature's voting, thanks to his PR, to give him very overt help. So once this all happens, these places of compounded violence, you get these wicked cycles, these wicked problems of violence. First, you get this Silicon Valley-like violence infrastructure, right? You get people who specialize in assassination. In Colombia, one of the people who was responsible for Mayor Mocas's police reform said to me, look, there are 3 generations of assassins in some families, grandfather, father, and son, 40 years of assassinations. You have talent jumping from group to group. So Don Berna, a famous paramilitary leader, started life as a Marxist guerrilla, and then he went on to become a drug cartel leader, and then he became a paramilitary leader. And so they take their talent one place to another. Jesse James actually started with Quantrill's Raiders and took the techniques that he learned in Civil War guerrilla action into his bank robbery. And you see this in these different places. So skills get built, there's an infrastructure of violence, how the arms get moved, people hanging on, people looking to move up in this career, and you basically create an entire market. And you get cycles. Okay, so you also get a decivilizing process. Steven Pinker talks about this. It's a problem. Let me get to the solution because I only have 2 minutes left. So the first step, when you have an extremely weak state, you get elite bargaining. And you see this in every single case. Now, these elite bargains, as Barry North and Wallace and Weingast talk about, they really do bring down violence. They bring it down quite quickly. But they don't last, right? They corrupt the state. They corrupt the state's ability to fight the violence. And they delegitimize the government, which, of course, is the reason you had privileged violence in the first place. And so what you see is that is sort of necessary for a while, but then what you need is to jump equilibrium. And since this is a problem of the political order, since this is a problem of the way that the elites with the privilege are structuring the whole security state, you need to jump to a new equilibrium, and that requires a real jolt to the system. And so Boo writes about this in Sweden and Denmark, and you see this in each of the cases. So the first step tends to be some extreme level of violence that touches the middle class. It's not just criminals killing criminals, it's starting to affect us. Often this needs to be organized to get people to realize it affects them. So in Georgia in the Rose Revolution, there's this sense that, yes, there's this violence, there's this corruption, it's all going on, we know this election's going to be stolen, we know the next one's going to be stolen. It actually takes kind of organizing to tell people, no, this time it really matters. And so there's a feedback loop between the social organization. That's the second step. You need to have mass movements of social organization, and Maria Stefan and Erica Chenoweth have written about this quite a bit, and their model of social organization, and goes back to, I don't know how to pronounce her name, but Theda Skocpol in the 70s. There's a whole theory of these kinds of revolutions, and it's pretty strong. My difference with it is that what I actually saw in the cases of success was that a successful politician needed to marry up with the movement. So the movements can't be totally oppositional to government. They need to work with political leadership because they need to take power. They can't simply pull down. Otherwise, the revolution is stillborn. they need to build up. And often what that means is that you don't get a community movement separate from the politician, you get a politician creating the movement. So you get a politician like the Rose Revolution, or this is Nitish Kumar and Bihar, who actually are building the base on which they're going to rise. And so it's a very different model of community organizing. These individual politicians do a lot of things in common. So one thing they do is build a lot of stuff. Frank Fukuyama was talking about this. I see this as, there's theories about this in urbanism. When I was talking to Fajardo and his chief of staff and so on, they were giving me the spiel of how they did it in Medellin. And what David said, his chief of staff, was, I challenged him and I said, you know, I worked in the Bronx, there's a subway there, just like your gondolas here, but you still have a lot of violence in the Bronx, and you know, the gondola I'm not so sure about. And what he said was very interesting. He said, look, we're trying to launch a civilizing process. And by telling people that the state wants to give them dignity, by putting these symbolic things in these areas, you're getting more feet on the ground in these areas, you're getting people to move in and out of the spaces more frequently, which is Jane Jacobs' theory of policing, basically, and social policing, but you're also launching this civilizing process, which is an interesting theory, and I saw it at work. You also see the leaders using the media a lot to tell a new story, to tell people that change is happening, to get this positive feedback loop. You also see a negative side of it. So you see a lot of executive centralization. The violent actors tend to put their people in the legislature. The legislature tends, therefore, to have a lot of criminal actors within it, and so you see a lot of centralization of the state. You see a lot of surveillance, intelligence work, wiretapping work happening to get at the violent actors, and you then see an uptick in state violence. And as that uptick happens, you need to start the whole cycle over again. And I'll end there, that what I saw was not a clear upward trajectory. What I saw was kind of this upward spiral of change, where things got better, and then they got more authoritarian and worse, and then they got better again after society organized again. And so each time you're sort of squeezing a little violence out of the system, but you're also just changing the balance of which side the violence falls on, from non-state to state actors and back. So thank you.
Okay, I'm going to try to be really quick because I'm sure there are a lot of questions. Reading Rachel's paper reminded me of the terrific yet disturbing book about violence in Colombia by anthropologist Mick Tausig, Law in a Lawless Land, Diary of a Limpieza in Colombia. He captures ethnographically and journalistically, literally in the form of a journal, the confusion on the ground about who is responsible for violence during a 2-week period in one part of Colombia in May 2001. He writes about, quote, soldiers who are not really soldiers, but more like ghosts, flitting between the visible and the invisible, between the regular army and the criminal underworld of killers and torturers that all states have no trouble recruiting when their backs are up against the wall, end quote. Tausig captures the profound disorder, anarchy, if you will, of a moment in time when paramilitaries roamed the countryside ostensibly to bring order by cleaning up the delinquents. The chaotic situation leads people into loyalties they might never have predicted and erodes trust, if there had ever been trust in the state, in paramilitaries, in the local drug traffickers. Threat looms very large. And so what I've just done is just to offer some of the sentiments, the images, the experiences of people in the kinds of situations of compound violence that you are working with. And I raise those not just because that's the way I study the world as an anthropologist, but because the policy implications, that second part of your paper, really take us into civil society and what can be done with civil society or in collaboration with civil society after that kind of violence. And there we must deal with what people on the ground have been thinking and feeling. And I think I raise that to encourage yet again that in these kinds of meetings that we find the space to talk across models in direct dialogue with the kinds of quotes and experiences that both of your papers have put on the table for us and that I think provide a kind of richness. Rachel's project demonstrates that compounded violence is not always the result of the collapse of government or a weak state, but is in fact generated by a particular organization of power. that comes out of privilege that a certain set of elites holds. The examples are convincing and concerning, and I think others in the audience are better positioned than I am to talk about methodology and whether and how to do this kind of comparison and whether it succeeds. But in my view, it's a really important pushback against the notion of failed states, and importantly directs attention to what will need to be new approaches to policy and investment that sort of follow on. But just how many states are we talking about here? In some examples, the experience of compounded violence was fleeting, but so many states could be imagined into this category. If one thinks not just about direct violence, but also about the threat of violence, about the tendency to overuse the force of the police, about the kind of ever-present rumbling gang that periodically uses extortion, about vigilante groups who we know have stockpiled guns. You know, this is easily the constellation of dynamics of violence in many contemporary states. So I'm wondering if the contemporary state is the state of privileged violence, a really important phrase, notwithstanding the level of direct compound violence evident at any particular moment. And of course, I mean to be provocative here, but I saw even in research I did in the coal fields of West Virginia in this century and in the last century, this same kind of constellation sort of readily peeking out or emerging. And here I think the threat of violence is really important in the analysis that you are doing, and what does it mean to live a life under the threat of compound violence. You make a small point, but very significant, about vigilante groups being under-researched, and I agree about that. It's a really important area for attention. Very interesting work on lynching in Bolivia and in a number of different places in sub-Saharan Africa. And again, I think that's a site for that kind of conversation that looks at broader models and really matches it up with what's going on the ground from the perspective of those living in those situations. At the same time, I'd suggest we also need to study groups that produce their own order without violence. How are neighborhoods securitized through nonviolent means? And there are examples of zones of peace, including in Colombia and in a variety of other places around the world. In Ferguson, Missouri now, African American groups are beginning to do their own policing with very different understandings about what policing means and about the nature of violence. So these are always fledgling kinds of projects, but I think they're really important ones to explore if we're thinking about expanding civil society's claims to provide order and of drawing on civil society to begin to push back on violence, whether it be from the state or another entity. So I will stop there and welcome questions. We'll do a couple of questions at a time and then allow for response. So take one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is fascinating, and it touches us Latin Americans very closely. So I congratulate you both on this amazing work, which I think has implications for all over the world. I would like to push a little bit to go deeper into the case of Colombia, because it is so interesting in the sense of the dramatic change that we've seen. And in particular, I would like to respectfully challenge Professor Fukuyama's, again, very short presentation of the characterization of the case, because I think it is factually wrong. And secondly, it is very dangerous to believe that. I do not think that describes the situation in Colombia correctly, which is, it was not, I would argue that the case is the opposite. It is not that the army pacified, integrated with the community to get information. That is a fight that I've had with US military and diplomats over the last 10 years. They see, if you land in an astronaut landing in Colombia, you see that. But that's not what happened. what happened, I contend, is that the society as a whole, at some point, everybody, every family had so many people affected by violence that the elites changed the way of seeing violence and adopted the counter strategy of integrating society. And even though Fajardo tells the story that way, the reality is that if you look at Bogota and Barranquilla and Bucaramanga, beyond Medellin, and even in Medellin, the story is the opposite, is completely the opposite. It goes more in the line of the civilizing process. And the objective was to bring pride and to bring belonging to the society. It was not to decrease violence. So the causality goes the other way around. And the implication for that is tremendous. So I would like to open that discussion respectfully.
Thank you. Thank you both for two wonderful presentations. The question is, or the comment, better, is for Beatriz. You posit like the existence of a dual social order at the end. The slide indicated the police and the gangs, but then, as Bukiamo was pushing, there are the gains from the pacification project and the gains for social welfare within the pacification project process. You mentioned that you are now running surveys on citizens, which I don't know if this is a new aspect of the project, but is there any way in which you might be able to gain some like additional knowledge on what the unintended or intended consequences for social welfare are based on the work of the UPP?
Thank you. Yeah. No,
Do the
they will
two.
do.
So, thank you, Juan. The case of Colombia, I love the case of Colombia because it's so rich both in data and depth. I'll give you my potted history, and then I would love to hear your thoughts. I mean, I start with La Violencia at the mid of the century, and basically say there was an elite pact in the National Front in which the two parties agree to share time at the trough, to split the ministries, to allow patronage on both sides, to keep the military fairly weak so they don't have another coup, and to allow paramilitary violence by the landlords and the rich so that they can keep the military weak and keep taxes low. And so it's a perfect elite pact. And from that moment, you get violence lower, as you usually do with elite pacts, but you also get a more and more unequal society. You get the violence of La Violencia turning into banditry and guerrilla violence, and eventually, after the United States fails at attempting to pacify it, breaking down into the FARC and so on. And then, as the violence starts climbing back up with drugs, as the drug violence just explodes in the 80s, you finally get this moment where citizens say enough. When you get Los Notables and the drug violence starting to hit the middle class and the cartels starting to kidnap the women of the upper class in order to send a message to the government. And that's that moment, the moment that I showed in Sicily with the bomb, when the upper class says, we can't do this anymore. We need to move from a power structure in which we give charity to the poor to a power structure in which people are empowered in a different political way, a very different power structure. And you get the 91 moment of revolution in the Constitution, when people pour out on the streets and change the Constitution. And to me, that's the juncture in Colombia. And that what happens after that, it takes a long time for independents to start getting elected, like Uribe, like Fajardo, like Mocas, but that break with the political parties and the political past is key. But then you get a very messy story. You get more elite pacts, smaller elite pacts of different sorts, like Los Pepes, that are allowed to take out the basically Cali cartel and half of Medellin cartel are allowed to take out Escobar's cartel and reconstitute. So you get all these messy little elite pacts, but as it's going on, the state's regaining power, taking back power at the same time you're having a civilizing process go on. So it's messy, but I agree with you that it was not about the pacification through the military force, that only worked because you had this fundamental power shift in 91 in society and a fundamental societal change in how they were going to deal with power.
So thank you for your question. We just actually received the data like a month ago. But we've been constantly doing focus groups with residents, a lot of interviews before pacification, after pacification. We actually, for example, we were there in the Complexo Alemán when the military left and the police was going to come in. We were there in Rosiña when a really dramatic assassination happened. We've been really observing the process very close. And so let me give you, two answers. One, for example, the question of how they feel about pacification before it happens. So this was a question I raised to many people residing in the favelas. So who do you fear more? So the police of the traffickers. And it's not like they don't fear the traffickers. They acknowledge the rule is cruel, complain that, for example, traffickers even impose the way you dress. So if you are from one faction, you cannot use one color. So they are aware that, the route is ruthless, but at least they know them. And so some of them really fear the police. They say only they come here to kill, no? But they are open to the process of pacification before this happens. So it was a lot of optimism before police were sent. The first pacification processes were very successful because they were done in easier favelas. So now we collected this data, and I have become more sort of concerned about the process. And more than anything, I've gained really this perspective. This is a process. There is not one single answer, and it really is a very difficult one. So I talked a lot to police by now, and I understand their job is really difficult. So when I saw no effect on homicides and all these scandals and so on, I thought, this is going to have no legitimacy. And then we started receiving the data, and overwhelming majority support the police. But they still complain about two things, and that's when you challenge me about theories. That's what I've been trying to really sort of do the last days, because I presented the paper, so I'm working on that. But one of the things I realized in these interviews is that they really complain a lot about this imperfect control. So they say the police is here, but the traffickers are also here. So we really feel very, fearful that if they are here and we approach the police, they are going to really target us. So this is really, I think, what, the perspective is underground, that they are really, at the moment, caught in between both. So this resident in one of the favelas, he is the guy who directs the public library, an intellectual in a way, and he, with anguish, described to us, he said, I fear so much fear. He said, I fear so much fear, but my fear is really simply to, he described to falar, so just to talk, express myself. And he said something really, striking. I have freedom, of the market. I can go and buy a telephone, but I cannot talk. I mean, I'm constantly, and this really describes a lot of, the way they feel. Some complain that the police is rude, that, so this is really, to me, the interviews give me more hope that the process really needs to be, sort of accomplished. Part of the problem is that everybody is now feeling fatigue, and especially the police. So they are really ready just to withdraw this. It's been such a big effort, such a big investment. And so part of the interesting aspect of our work is that we've been really seeing this sort of pull between the police officers, some who want to reform, some who want to go back to the old. And you see these, some officers are really the old violent ones, and they want to go back to that. So that is really, it's fascinating, but there is no simple answer to this question. But I feel a little bit more hopeful. I've been going like this. Yeah, so.
Margaret.
So my question or comment is really to both of you. So Rachel, you used the term compound violence, but I also heard a lot about compound legitimacy in both of your cases.
Yes.
And I really was, I think Frank was having the same set of issues. I wasn't always sure what the basis of that was. You say that you imply that legitimacy is based on some kind of trust, but trust of whom? By whom? Over what? Who's getting protected and who is not, and by whom? And I mean, so the drug lords may be protecting certain people that the police are not, and vice versa. How much of it depends on security and how much on social benefits, or some combination of the two?
Yes.
So I think in order to understand the question of violence here and the role of the police in a way, you have to have also understand the positive and how you create an alternative or invest the alternative with some kind of legitimacy or trust.
Yes.
A comment and two, I hope, related questions, maybe at the margin of your studies. The comment is, great work. It's hard to intellectually move away from root causes
yes, and I think it's brilliant that Beatrice, you are dealing with the problems that exist. And I think that some of Rachel's work goes more to what's causing this kind of violence in the places. But I just hope that the research keeps going forward in both regards. I think that you can't not treat the problems as problems, but I think also long term we've got to be much smarter about what the root causes are of this kind of criminal conduct.
Maybe I'll.
The question at the margin is, a lot of talk about trafficking. Where, if at all, does human trafficking fit into this picture? And in terms of private violence, where does domestic violence fit into this? If we're going to try to solve the problem of all kinds of violence, it seems to me that domestic violence probably is of a real scale in a lot of these communities and deserves to be better known and understood in terms of what it is and why it happens.
Let me grab one more question. Brad, I saw
So,
your hand.
this is for Rachel. I'm curious about the story in the American South, because you have exogenous forced enfranchisement in Reconstruction. You have policy implementation with various forms of disenfranchisement until it, effectively climaxes in the white primary, and complete disenfranchisement, which lasts until there's another exogenous forced enfranchisement. So, how much can we learn there? I mean, all of these things are being driven at the federal level to have these changes. No.
Do you want to go first?
I'm just curious, like, how that fits into the framework.
So, second question about domestic violence. I think what is fascinating, at least in this process in the pacification, is that when the police were introduced, the UPP, you had a huge spike in the denounces against domestic violence, and I think this is really very interesting because the weakest individuals, women, children, are the ones who stand to lose a lot when the drug lords are ruling, So, somebody does something to you as a woman, violates you, a drug trafficker who is your partner, there is no one you can resort to. And they normally impose their own rule on this, sort of their own language in terms of how to treat women and so on. And one of the interesting aspects is that when police arrive, you start to see all these demands of, against domestic violence. And I think this is very interesting. That suggests, who benefits and who loses from informal forms of order, no? So that is a really interesting question, I think. In terms of human trafficking, I think I don't know about Rio itself, but we know that in Mexico this has been dramatically increasing, and it's just something I don't know too much about. But talking about this compounded, I mean, the violence is becoming increasingly more brutal and affecting more dimensions, and it's just decomposing sort of the sort of moral fabric in a very profound way. So, going back to your questions about root causes, I mean, we know a lot about inequality. We really have to explore that link more. Every time I go to Brazil, it's like, living in two worlds. I go to, for example, just trying to get to the favelas, which some of them, it's very hard to reach them. So you have to take a taxi. I mean, sometimes we have to take do like this 7 times for someone to be willing to take us, So this is just like a completely parted city. And then you are in Ipanema, and you listen to the way people refer to black people living in the favela, and you just clearly connect one with the other. What really I need to explore more, and this is something I want to do next, is really, I think that security policies have been set in place by governments responding to fears of the middle class and the high class, and really has been very damaging. So and this is really something that deeply needs to change. So with that, I mean, that's the way inequality is fitting into this problem, but there are all other issues as well. I mean, drug trafficking is a major cause of all the violence I showed across Latin America, and that the source, obviously, it's also here. It has to do with, how profitable these markets are. So, but I agree with you. These are really important questions. That's what, I become obsessed with this question now because it's just a very complicated issue, to understand all the mechanisms of, sort of social violence, no? Yes.
Fantastic set of questions. Let's see, on Margaret's, I think you're absolutely right about legitimacy and what are the sources of legitimacy, and it's my comment to Frank about the Army's kind of Marxist way of thinking of legitimacy as just about outputs and just about money. I did another paper on Afghanistan with a friend who had been part of a national counterterror cell, and there what they found was that all the efforts to buy hearts and minds were backfiring because the idea of paying money for piety was seen as so distasteful that it actually delegitimized the whole effort. And so I think sources of legitimacy are unique to countries and to communities. There's some overarching process and output, and I think some people stray too much on one side, and I think that you need both. And actually in the paper I quote your own work about the kind of spiral of legitimacy and that it's a tipping point issue and so on, which I think is very much true. As people start opting out of a state being legitimate, more people feel comfortable doing that, and the state becomes less legitimate. So I think it's an important and very difficult question. And I think just to cite our colleague at CASBIS, Marty Gilliams' work on who the state responds to, I find very much that security policy, whether it's in post-colonial states where security was set by the colonizer or in our own countries, it's set by the upper class, not even the middle class generally. I mean, depending on how the state is arranged, security is security for someone. And that means that there's less security for certain other people, and often that breaks down who has a state, who sees the state as legitimate and who doesn't. I got my start in this work in New Haven, and I can say in New Haven, where I worked for the city council in trying to fight drug dealers, there were a lot of people in New Haven who didn't see the state as very legitimate, and that's why you see Baltimore and St. Louis, some of those countries there. Bill, your point, I don't know much about human trafficking, so I can't really say anything about it. And I really don't know much about domestic violence either, but I'll venture some thoughts because it's been really on my mind while doing this work, because I don't treat domestic violence in here, in part because the statistics are horrible. For the reasons Beatriz says, that when things get better, people often report more. In certain places like Bihar, upper caste police won't take domestic violence reports from lower caste women, and so it's very political when you get people who take your report. So it's very hard to get your arms around it. But I have this gut feeling that there's something fractal going on about violence, that there's something that connects intimate violence, higher level violence, and so on. And I think you can actually get into some of the genetics of violence, the epigenetics of violence actually, where being among, witnessing as a child a lot of violent acts actually affects your own impulse control and creates cycles of violence within families. And you also see this, like in Colombia, you see groups who were peasants who got kicked off their land and go to the slums, and the woman gets a job as a domestic. It's a very common pattern. The man can't get a job because the man had been a farmer. And then you get domestic violence because of the change in the situation in the family. And then what does the kid see in that situation? And how does the kid respond now that they're in a slum where there's gang opportunities and other violence opportunities to act out? And so I think there's this fractal activity going on, but I can't prove it, and I don't know how you would. And then the U.S. South. Sorry, extremely briefly on the U.S. South. I don't think it's exogenous. I mean, if you actually look at the violence in the U.S. South, the Ku Klux Klan, the White League, the various different vigilante groups, they kill 1,000 people in Louisiana in 1968. They killed 2,000 in Kansas. They affect the course of the elections. That election forces federal control because people are, so that's not exogenous. That's an endogenous activity that's getting the feds to say, you don't get to control your situation anymore. And then in the contested election of 72, they basically create so much electoral violence that they get to say, we'll give up the presidential election that we think we won. We Democrats will give up that presidential election to a Republican, but you better get your troops out of the South. And so again, I think it's endogenous, not exogenous. It's the use of violence to retake control. And then if you look at the SNCC and the movement in the 60s, again, yes, there's freedom riders coming from the North, but that's also a Southern movement that brings in external help. So I'm not so sure, I think, of the exogeneity, but that's...
Thank you. I want to thank members of the panel.